So, first I'd like to thank everyone for coming. For those of you that don't know, we have one of the most important people that's responsible for the Transformers characters, okay? The Transformers toys were designed in Japan, but when they were brought over to the United States, basically Marvel Comics was tasked with giving the characters a backstory, and so they hired certain people at Marvel to write the backstory and create all the characters. And we have someone here who's responsible for almost all of the characters' names, about 250 from what I've read, unless I'm incorrect. So almost all the names that you're familiar with, Megatron, Bumblebee, Wheeljack, Starscream, they were all thought of by one person, okay? He's also responsible for writing the backs of the packages, the tech specs cards, and he wrote the comic book from number 5 to number 55, okay? So I'd like to give everyone a very warm welcome to New Jersey's own Bob Budiansky.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me here, and I'm happy to talk to you about my experiences on Transformers as well as many other things at Marvel that I did. But first, I do have a little bit of a presentation here. Here's how I got involved with Transformers. I was a Marvel staff editor back in the 1980s, and in 1983, Marvel and Hasbro came together to make some kind of a deal which did not involve me at all. I was not in the room when this happened. And the deal basically followed the deal that Marvel and Hasbro had made a couple years earlier for G.I. Joe, which was Hasbro was introducing this new line of toys, and they wanted Marvel to come on board to help develop a storyline or a backstory and to develop characters. So initially, the Marvel editor-in-chief at the time, Jim Shooter, as part of his day job, as he's pointed out to me, he wrote the backstory. So basically, he didn't get paid anything extra for it. It's that backstory that everything since about Transformers is based on. So I wrote about a 6-page backstory, which is what you're seeing here on the screen. That's page 1. Okay, so Jim wrote that, and then he hired a staff editor who wasn't me to develop the characters. So initially, there were 26 Transformers. About 16 Autobots and 8 Decepticons or something like that. It was more Autobots than Decepticons. And he went to the most senior editors on the staff who had a lot of writing experience, said, okay, we need these 26 characters developed into names and personalities. And for whatever reason, again, I wasn't in the room yet, Jim did not find what this editor produced to his liking. So he rejected almost all of it. He did not reject Optimus Prime, so that name was already there when I came on board. And I think there was maybe 1 or 2 other names in that initial group that made it through Jim's screening process. So at that point, Jim was getting kind of desperate because he did have a deadline approaching where he had to turn something into Hasbro that he approved of, that he would hope that Hasbro would approve of. So, so he went down what's called editorial row, which was one editorial office after another. He didn't literally go down each editorial office consecutively, but he went to a few different editors who had writing experience, including Larry Hama, who had developed G.I. Joe, and said, I need these characters developed, can you do it? I'll hire you to do it. And one by one, they turned him down. So I was probably about the 4th or 5th choice. And I was an editor, but I was known more as an artist at that time than a writer, so I wasn't the obvious choice. But anyway, he came to me, and basically he asked me the same question he'd asked the other editors, I suppose, which was, can you do this, and can you do this in a hurry? Let me digress for a moment. Does Canada also celebrate Thanksgiving in November like the United States does?
More like October.
Okay, well we have it like the last Thursday in November. So this is the week before that week. So people are trying to get their work done. Some people are going back home for vacation, to visit their family for a little Thanksgiving vacation or whatever. So this is the week before that week. So I got that assignment like on maybe a Wednesday or a Thursday, and was told, okay, we need this like Monday or Tuesday to send it up to Hasbro before Thanksgiving, before they all take off for a few days. So over that weekend, or that slightly longer than a weekend, maybe I had 3 or 4 days to do it, I developed the 26 characters and their profiles, turned it in that Monday, I think, to Jim, and he liked it. So that's how I got involved. So, so basically, almost all the names and all the personality profiles and all the toy packaging that came out of that particular first initial phase of Transformers I produced. Then it went to Hasbro. Hasbro looked at it and they decided whether they liked it or not, and generally they liked it. And I'll get into that more specifics as we go through this. But basically that's how I got involved on this kind of a rush basis, and over the weekend I came up with something that Jim liked. So what you're seeing here, this is the initial treatment that Jim wrote. I don't know if this is, second, third, fourth draft, but this is what was given to me. This page 2, it basically describes the whole story, page 3, so on. And you'll see, maybe not on this page, you see all those things crossed out there and other things written in by hand. That's my handwriting. So as this developed, Jim was changing little aspects of his treatment, and I was literally crossing out those words and replacing them with other words. So for instance, the Ark, which is a spaceship that crash landed on Earth in the Transformers mythology, was originally called Anti. I don't know why Jim called it Anti originally, but he decided to change it, probably wisely, and so on. So little changes like that you'll see throughout this. But that's the original treatment with my original handwritten changes on it, and so on and so forth. And some of the names changed, like there's a human character named Buster Witwicky. Originally his name was Spike Witwicky. So there's a lot of confusion, I think, once he went into the cartoon about what his name was. I wasn't involved with dealing directly with the producers of the cartoon, so I don't know why the name changed from one. I think they got an earlier version of this at some point. And then you see there's some character profiles, which is things that I guess survived the first phase of Jim handing it out to a different writer to produce these character profiles. So again, you can see like Starscream's original name was Oktar in the top left corner there. I guess that's one of the reasons why Jim wanted somebody else to work on this, to translate it into something resembling English. So that's when I got involved. Okay, so now what you're looking at is my original handwritten legal pad paper as I developed these characters. So I just had this yellow legal pad and I started writing and writing and writing. I had the toys. At the time, Marvel made a deal with Hasbro. Hasbro had licensed or made some kind of deal with 2 Japanese toy companies, Takara and Bandai, to take pre-existing toys and just rebrand them as Transformers. So I was given a whole bunch of toys to look at over a weekend, and from those toys I was able to come up with names and character profiles, etc. And then I wrote it out like this, and then brought it back to the office, and eventually somebody who was a much better typist than me typed it up. So which one is this? I can't even see. This is Optimus Prime. So although I did not name Optimus Prime, I did eventually write his profile. This is Megatron. So Megatron originally was a name that I came up with that Hasbro rejected. I was told by the product manager at Hasbro the name sounded too scary, which was an interesting criticism of a character who was supposed to be the head of the bad guys. So I understood that I was just being hired to develop these names and profiles. It wasn't my property. I didn't create the Transformers. On the other hand, I kind of liked this particular name, Megatron. So I decided to fight for it a little bit. So very gently I went to Hasbro. And remember, this is like the very beginning of my relationship with these people. I didn't know them. They didn't know me. I said, so I understand you didn't like Megatron. And this happened on a few names that I came up with. For one reason or another, they were rejected. So I understand you don't like Megatron. Can I ask you why? It sounds too scary. So very gently I pointed out to them that he's the head of the bad guys. He's supposed to sound scary. So they thought about it for a moment, and they reconsidered, and they allowed the name to pass. So I think we're all thankful for that. And this is Starscream, who, like you saw earlier, was originally called Oktar in the original draft. So this is what I did. I just developed these. Just to give you an idea of the very beginning of this creative process. And this one is Ratchet. So I was just talking to somebody earlier today, like how I came up with some names. So Ratchet, for instance, came from 2 different ideas. One was, well, first of all, I made Ratchet a medic. So a Ratchet itself is a tool. So I figured, naming an Autobot after a tool that fixes things was, a good idea if you want to make it a medic. The other thing was, there's an old book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was also made into a movie with Jack Nicholson starring in it back in the 1970s. So the antagonist in that book, where basically Jack Nicholson's character is locked up in an insane asylum, the antagonist is named Nurse Ratchet. So I put together the Ratchet the tool and Nurse Ratchet and made Ratchet the medic for the Autobots. And this is, I think Jaguar became Ravage eventually. Yeah.
It's codename Stalker.
Yeah, that didn't pass. It became Ravage. Yeah, and Fireball, yeah, this one didn't pass either. Fireball, I think it became Shockwave.
This is not about Jetfire.
Jetfire, oh, Jetfire.
Yeah.
Jetfire, okay. Is that Bumblebee?
Bumblebee.
Yeah. I think Bumblebee's original name, I think, was Goldbug, and that one got changed. But I think that preceded me. It was Bumblebee. Okay, so then I took those longer profiles and I shrunk them down to these more abbreviated versions so that they could fit on the toy packaging. And you can see at the bottom, I wrote different technical specifications of strength, intelligence, but anyway, all that went on the toy packaging. So I came up with the idea for Hasbro to come up with technical specifications. So that's my original handwritten chart of all 26 Transformers. So I could compare, I wanted to make sure, like for instance, that Optimus Prime was a bit stronger than Bumblebee and so on. So that's my little chart there, right, that told me relative to each other how strong or how fast or how intelligent, etc., each character was. And then Hasbro took that and they made a nicer, cleaner version of it. But it's the same information, the same characters, and that's the initial 26 Transformers. And all that information went on the back of the toy boxes. And there's the toy box, Optimus Prime, from the first generation of him. And there's the information I was referring to earlier. So you have the little abbreviated profile of each character, and then in that red kind of graphic looking area, you have the technical specifications. And I don't know how many of you collected Transformers back in the 1980s, but I believe it came with a little piece of red cellophane. So if you ran the red cellophane over that graph, you could actually see the specs. And then as Transformers continued, Hasbro would roll out more and more product lines every like 6 months or so. They'd come out with a whole bunch of... Hasbro, like everybody else, could not anticipate the success of Transformers. It was enormously successful between the animated series, the toy, and the comic book. Everything was enormously popular. So the comic book, which was originally planned for 4 issues as a miniseries, continued. Hasbro continued to roll out new lines of toys. So they would send me every few months one of these product listings of here's a whole bunch of new toys, go ahead and name them and make profiles out of them. And you can see it goes on. And they would just say, okay, this is a pterodactyl, or this is a construction vehicle, or whatever. So here's what I would get. So after Hasbro ran out of the licensed toys from the 2 Japanese toy companies, Hasbro would produce their own designs for toys. I don't remember how long the toys lasted, the actual toys themselves, but eventually, after like a year or two, Hasbro started producing their own toy designs. So I would get what are called model sheets. So this model sheet, and I think probably the next one also is the same character. This is a Decepticon that's sort of like a lobster. It basically shows the various transitions, the robotic form and the monster form, or the vehicle form and all that. And that's what I would base whatever I came up with as far as writing names and profiles. So this became Nautilator, this particular character. And there's my profile that goes with it. And here's another one that became Snakeskin. So again, I just got reams and reams of these model sheets to work with over the years. And again, different forms of snakeskin. And then we get to the comic book. Okay, so actually the comic book preceded a lot of that information I just showed you. But the comic came out in 1984. There's issue number 1. You see it says 1 in a 4-issue limited series. So Marvel was taking no chances. They weren't expecting anything great out of this. Just planned as a 4-issue miniseries. But lo and behold, here's issue 5.
My favorite cover.
Oh, okay. Well, I had nothing to do with it, but I know it's a favorite of a lot of people. But issue 1 through 4, I was the editor. I was the obvious choice to be. I was a staff editor, since I was so involved in the development of the characters and the storyline. I was the obvious choice to be the editor of the book once it came out as a miniseries. But I was what was called the special projects editor, which at that time at Marvel meant that I was not editing any regular monthly comic books. I had been doing that, and then Jim Shooter created this new job as special projects editor. So I would do licensed properties, movie adaptations, all sorts of odds and ends, and these miniseries, a few different miniseries actually. And so when Transformers was a miniseries, I was the editor. And as a miniseries, for 4 issues, I had 3 different writers, which is extremely unusual. Usually when you have a miniseries, you have 1 artist or 1 artistic team and 1 writer, period. You don't jump back and forth between writers. But Transformers was such a difficult concept for these writers to really get a handle on. There were so many characters, and there was all this mythology that was introduced in that storyline that I showed you earlier. So they would burn out. And I was basically dictating to these writers, well, how to make the story work. I was doing the work for them. Not that I wanted to. I was the editor. I'm not supposed to be dictating plot points to the writers. But in any case, over 4 issues, we had 3 different writers. So with issue 5, the book was taken away from me and given to a regular line editor because it was no longer a special project. It was a regular book. And so when the new editor came aboard, he said to me, "So Bob, I'm taking over Transformers. What's your advice?" So I said, "Well, my advice is fire the writer that's on it now and hire me, since I'm doing all the work anyway." So that's what he did. And I wasn't doing that out of, crass, greed or anything. I just felt like the writers were basically just hanging on by their fingernails anyway. And as I like to put it, the writer who was fired was a mercy killing. I think he appreciated getting off the book. And we're still friends today. So anyway, this is issue 5 is when I took over. And this is how comics at that time were written. I don't think they were written that differently nowadays. But basically, the Marvel style of writing, the writer came up with a plot. So the plot basically is a visual description of what the book is going to look like, but it's not the dialogue. So after the book is drawn, it goes back to the writer, and the writer scripts the dialogue. So that was the first page of the plot for this particular issue, Into the Smelting Pool. And actually, it's my favorite issue that I wrote. And here's another plot. And what I would do for the sake of the artist, kind of like prepare them for the worst, I would list the name of the characters they had to draw that issue. So like you see, there's about 15 or 20 Transformers there at the top, so they would know, okay, I got to collect all the reference materials I need to be able to draw these characters and get it ready for this particular issue. The artist hated me, like asking them to draw. I mean, not that they hated me, but this was a beast to draw because there was so much reference. Unlike, Spider-Man is just Spider-Man, and maybe a villain or two. But this, you had to draw all these guys, and they all had different details, and it was a lot of work for an artist. But that's how it went. So this is another example of a plot, or the beginning of a plot. And I guess that was for this one. This is a Decepticon graffiti. Which, by the way, this issue was really special for me because I got a fan letter from a very special person. As you know, fans, maybe you were among them, write fan letters, and sometimes the comic books would print them. This particular issue got a fan letter from Stan Lee. So I was very flattered that he, A, took the time to read it, and B, wrote a nice letter about it. And the editor of the book was sure to print that fan mail in the subsequent issue, a couple issues later. Among the many things that I did on Transformers, I drew a few of the covers, but I actually, more than just drew the covers, I did the layouts for most of the covers on the books that I wrote, even if I didn't draw the covers myself. So this is what went into a sketch for a cover. So here's something I sketched. That might take me like 5 or 10 minutes to put that together. That would go to the editor. The editor would either approve it or disapprove it or ask for some changes. Once the sketch was approved, it would go to the artist. So this is the covers are particularly important for a comic because that's what really sells the book, what people see on the cover. So this is the initial sketch for Transformers number 29, it looks like. And there's the cover. And this one actually I drew myself. I did about a half a dozen of the Transformer covers. So this one, I had a certain idea. I wanted to get it across to the artist who was drawing the interior of the book. So I really wanted to get the cover the right way so he can use that as a basis for drawing the interior for these little scraplets characters. And here's another example of a cover sketch that I did, and it, explains what's going on, it shows what's going on, and this was handed to a different artist. So I did the cover sketch, and Jose Delbo who drew this cover, I believe. And once again, cover sketch. This was a interesting example of saving on my taxes. Okay, so I learned from a Saturday Night Live skit back in the early 80s that this particular person on the show held up postcards of his various vacations. He went to Hawaii, here's a postcard from Hawaii, the audience laughs. He said, so you laughed, tax deduction. That whole trip's a tax deduction. So here I went to the Grand Canyon. I decided I'll write a story with the Grand Canyon in it. And there it is. And that one I drew myself as well. So I was able to deduct that trip. And then I showed the comic book to my accountant, who was very proud of me. Because I could show evidence that this was actually used for business purposes. And here's another cover sketch, and that's another cover I drew. Most of the time, the only covers I was interested in drawing were ones that featured human beings somewhat, except for that Scraplets cover, because I really didn't care for drawing the robots. Too many details to follow. And then all of these profiles that I had written over the years got collected into what was called the Transformers universe, And so it's like a little encyclopedia of everything Transformers, at least at that time, at least up to that time. And then as the Transformers further developed, there were extensions to the line. Like we had this initial storyline that Jim Shooter wrote, which was very limited, but because Hasbro was introducing literally hundreds of new characters, we had to figure out new ways to bring in more characters and extend the mythology beyond the basic mythology that Jim had come up with. So this was a draft of a treatment for an extension into Headmasters, which was another Transformers extension, which I wrote. And then this became this treatment. And here's the Headmasters comic book. So that became a mini-series, and then these characters got folded into the regular book. And other stuff. Over the years, as I extended the mythology, at different times Hasbro would ask me to write it out so they could share it with their animation studio that they were working with or whoever. So here's the creation matrix, which became a basic element of the mythology that I had developed. And finally, I guess this is showing the creation matrix in use, this particular issue of the book. But just an example of a really nice splash page drawn by Herb Trimpe, and I think that's the end of my little presentation.
Okay. All right.
So that's it. So basically I worked on Transformers from November '83 till the first few months of 1989. I'd been begging to get off of it for about a year because I was burning out on it. As a writer, it's nice to have a character or a group of characters that you can work with, that you can develop. But the problem with Transformers was, and I say this with keeping in mind that I really liked working with Hasbro and the different people there. They were all wonderful. But because it kept introducing dozens and dozens of new Transformers over those years, I had to find new ways to introduce these characters. So I might be having a good time developing a particular character or a couple of characters in the stories, and then all of a sudden I had to kind of shove them aside and make way for 20 new characters. And it was becoming more and more of a burden to me, and I felt like at some point I needed to, get on with it and go on to something else, which is what I did. So, so back in February of 1989, I was taking a little vacation in England. And at that time, Simon Furman, if you're familiar with Transformers, Simon Furman's a longtime writer of the Transformers. He's an English writer. He had been doing the fill-in issues for the English reprint comics of the Transformers. They had to fill in some extra stories here and there to keep on their own schedule. So I had met him on at least one occasion when he came to the Marvel New York offices. So anyway, in 1989 in February, I was in England. We met for lunch, and I said, Simon, I would love to get off this book. Would you like to take it over? And he jumped at the chance, and he became Mr. Transformers after that for a good number of years, still is. And now, as the writer of the Transformers, and I was not the editor then, I was the writer, it's really not my job to find my replacement. But when I came back to New York and told Don Daly, who was the editor, that I had gotten Simon to replace me, he was happy with that. He didn't mind me stepping on his toes and taking his job over for him. He was very appreciative of it. And so anyway, that ended my Transformers career at that time. So that's it. In a nutshell.